Hi, I'm Pete Betke, professor of economics here at George Mason University, and also a vice president over at the Mercatus Center. The Mercatus Center is a university-based think tank, a research center, and we're devoted to the idea of the cutting edge of taking the cutting edge of academics and bringing that over to the pressing issues of public policy. And in 2012, we established a program called the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, which focuses on the integration of those three disciplines to address the problems of social change, and in particular, social change with respect to increasing peace and prosperity. As you can see from the quote from Hayek up here, it is an interdisciplinary project. We take that very seriously, but it's grounded in economics. And starting a year ago, we started having some public events, these Hayek events. Last year, we focused on the 40th anniversary of Hayek receiving the Nobel Prize and where the research legacy is going from that. And our focus is always on that issue. It's going onwards and upwards rather than backward looking, though sometimes we need to reconstruct the past in order to figure out where we're going in the future in these research agendas. And so today we're very fortunate because we have Richard Epstein, who in many ways needs no introduction, but Richard is pushing forward the program of classical liberalism and has been doing so for many decades. In a consistent and persistent way in the fields of law, economics, legal philosophy, natural law, and all of these ideas. So Richard Epstein is the inaugural Laurence Tisch Professor of Law and the director of the Classical Liberal Institute at New York University. He is also the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and a senior lecturer at the University of Chicago. He is the author of many books, and most recently, the Classical Liberal Constitution, which was available out in front for you to purchase and then get signed from Richard after his talk. And today he's going to talk to us about the continuing relevance of the Constitution of Liberty. And without any further interruptions from me, Richard, please come on up. And please welcome Richard Epstein.
Oh, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. And now I have to prepare my speech. As I look around, I discover to my horror that this is a program in philosophy, politics, and economics, and I am a lawyer, a lowly lawyer at that. But the topic actually fits my personality to a T for the following reason. When I was an undergraduate at Columbia College, I had sufficient attention deficit disorder that I could never major in anything. So what I did is I concocted a program where I concentrated in three fields, I think. None of them was economics. One of them was sociology. One was mathematics. And God, I don't even remember. Oh, philosophy was the third. And in effect, that's the same sort of mental map that you see in somebody like Friedrich Hayek. He too had this kind of, shall we say, lack of concentration and focus on a single thing, and was always trying to work in an integrative fashion across multiple disciplines. And I think in many cases, if you follow correctly the law of diminishing marginal returns, specialization turns out to be a losing proposition if what you're trying to do is to get a synoptic view of the way in which you understand various kinds of social problems. And so from a fairly young age, I was always drawn to Hayek. He was one of the H's in my life. There was Hume, there was Hobbes, right? There was. There was Holmes and there was Hayek, and there was H.L.A. Hart. Yeah, really, there are a lot of H guys out there, and an E is very bad. And the other thing you need to know to be truly great is your name has to have one syllable or be mellifluous like Hayekian, right? In order to achieve things. And I started off as a lawyer, and I started off as a lawyer who mainly specialized in private law, property contracts and torts, taught in the English tradition first. If somebody were to ask me what the most powerful influence on my thinking is, I would probably say, all things considered, it's been the Roman law that I've studied and taught for 40-odd years now, actually 50-odd years, which has shaped everything that I've done. Just yesterday when I was, or 2 days ago, at NYU, I gave a lecture on early common law property rights under the Roman system going through Gaius and Justinian. And essentially what that does is it keeps you on your toes. Hayek was the same way, and the book, The Constitution of Liberty, is a kind of an odd mixture. If you actually pick it up, it reads like a text in the front, and then there's packed into the back 150 pages of detailed footnotes, which show that the guy had probably read everything that had ever been written, which was relevant to his topic, and managed to keep the technical stuff out of view of anybody except the most diligent of readers. And what was so striking about our friend Hayek was essentially, and his great contribution is he did have a synthetic framework about the way in which one ought to look at law. And he did it at a very high level of abstraction. And what was the basic elements of the framework that he had? And they're the ones which still endure today and set the basic agenda for our research. And the first of these particular things, and probably the primary one, was to sort of try to figure out how you put together three different elements. One of them is the question of what you do with respect to the procedures by which various kinds of rights and duties are determined. And Hayek was a great and passionate defender of the rule of law, but he was well aware of both its strength and its limitations. Taking a leaf from the great work of John Locke, whose name does not begin with H, what he did is he said, you know, if you really want to run a system right, you have to have general rules. They cannot have retroactive application. They must be applied by a fair and a neutral judge, and they must be coherent in a way that the ordinary citizen who's going to be governed by them can understand the way in which they start to work. And so what happens is this conception of rule, later popularized in American jurisprudence by Lon Fuller, becomes one of the essential bulwarks of liberty, because as we know, the power to select targets of government action is in fact one of the most dangerous things that you can ever have. And so a rule which is less general, more selective, and more discretionary can lead to a great deal more mischief than a rule which comports with the rule of law. My good friend Douglas Ginsburg is giving a Hayek lecture at NYU next week, I'm happy to say. And this title is, I think, The Illiberal Administrative Mistake, if I'm not wrong. And essentially what it does is it takes into a concrete area the same kinds of concerns that Hayek had before the, shall we say, the modern development of the administrative state in the post-Great Society era. But Hayek, writing in 1960, certainly was aware of all of the transformations in the administrative state that had taken place in the American experience, at least during the 1930s and the New Deal period. At the same time, Hayek was fully aware of the fact that if you just had a rule of law and you did not have any substantive components that were contained within that particular situation, it would not be sufficient. One of the dangers about general propositions is what they do is they magnify the error if things are bad, just as they magnify the good things if things are going well. So if you have an oppressive regime which says that no individual shall have any freedom of speech, you've given notice to various people. You have a rule of general application. You don't have to be biased in the way in which you shut everybody up. You can do it to all people. And in fact, what happens is the generalization is now the source of danger. So what has to happen is you must go beyond the parity principles and develop some kind of a substantive norm which, when married to the rule of law, will allow you to get results which you find are defensible. And the basic way in which Hayek tries to do that is to make liberty the primary good that you have to deal with in society. And he says, in effect, that all the laws that you're going to create are designed to preserve a space of autonomy within a perimeter of rights of all the individuals who are in that society, and you must do so in a way that is such that it's compatible for each person to exercise his own liberty without trenching upon the liberties of others. And so rather than spending his time explicating liberty, he tends to turn the thing around a little bit, and he starts to explicate the notion of coercion. If you go back and you read the early portions of the Constitution of Liberty, it's a frighteningly broad definition. He says somebody coerces you, or when in effect they exercise control over your life so that you're no longer able to execute a coherent plan of your own. And frankly, I still don't know what that exactly means, because I've never been coherent in anything that I've ever been able to exercise, so I don't meet the minimum conditions of rationality. But To be more precise, he then has an entire chapter where he starts to go into this particular notion, where he has a great deal more precision. And as I start to go beyond Hayek and critique it a little bit, I will talk about the relationship of liberty and coercion, first in Hayek and then in more modern legal type circumstances. And the third element, of course, that you need in order to make a legal system work is to understand that there have to be institutional structures in which the various procedures and the various substantive rights are going to be embedded. And when Hayek starts to talk about this, he's a little bit gauzy. There's actually one passage there where if you look in the index, it says it's about separation of powers. And if you actually look in the text, he's actually talking about federalism. And it's not at all clear that Hayek is actually sharply distinguishing between the two of them. If you look at the American Constitution, of course, redundancy of protection against government power was one of its central themes. And so we are very ambitious. We use both of these kinds of arrangements in extremely complicated ways. We have separation of powers at the federal level, and we have, at least at the time of the original Constitution, a very complicated system of federalism that tries to reserve some things for the federal governments and something for the states. And essentially what happens is these whole structural sets of precautions start from a presumption of liberty in the following sense. If in fact you believe that liberty is an important thing, and if you think that governments could be subject to various kinds of influences and pressures that are less than ideal, what you try to do is to make the burden of enacting laws a little bit more heavy than it would be if you thought that everybody who had to decide upon these issues was some kind of a disinterested soul. And therefore, you slow things down. You manage to smash things up. You allow branch to check branch and all the rest of that. And this was actually fairly well understood and clearly articulated by James Madison when he described this entire system in Federalist 51, I believe, where you set ambition against ambition. You have to be aware, of course, that sometimes when you put these machines into operation, they can spin out of control. But I think that virtually everybody who was involved in the organization of the American government, or indeed any others, understood that a constitution was a high-risk venture. It's a republic, not a republican. It's a republic if you can keep it. By Benjamin Franklin, who was at the convention, was essentially a perfectly sensible notion to indicate this is a precarious idea. And if you just have structures and rules and procedures that you think are right, and you get all the wrong people in all the wrong places at all the wrong time, the whole thing will essentially go down. So the secret of success in many ways is to be deeply aware of the very heavy possibility of failure. Hope that that can be institutionalized culturally so that when people start to take their own offices, they realize of the terrible dangers that could exist if they push their own administrative, legal, legislative, or executive powers to the limit, because that's going to provoke a response on the other side, and it turns out that you could easily spin out of control. And once that happens, no set of constitutional guidelines, given that they're always incomplete in certain decisive ways, are going to be able to protect you. Now, if you have all of this stuff, then the question is, do you have a particular theory which is going to allow you to explain why and how this thing works? And on this particular sort, Hayek, in fact, has a very interesting set of ideas which are provocative on the one hand, but ultimately, I think, not sufficiently fine-grained in order to carry the day. In the Constitution of Liberty and just about everything else that Hayek starts to write, what he does is he starts to treat ignorance as essentially the settled and unescapable condition of mankind. And what he means by that particular element is that if you look around and you're trying to figure out the preference sets of other individuals, if you're trying to figure out the way in which they're going to interact, what happens is you could easily be defeated by the sheer complexity of the way in which things start to go on. And what you have to do is to sort of guide your institutions, taking into account the fact that your ignorance and the ignorance of everybody else, in fact, is a dominant social feature. And I think that he's right to say that ignorance is certainly an important issue, but I'd like to refine it a little bit more. Because if, in fact, the only thing you have out there is a kind of ignorance, then you're never going to be smart enough to set up your basic constitutional structures to begin with, because by definition, it turns out you're pretty much ignorant of just about everything. And so what you have to do is to figure out those areas in which you have relatively greater knowledge and those areas in which you have relatively less knowledge, and then try and work out a system in that light. So if you want to compare Hayek's use of ignorance with John Rawls and the veil of ignorance, it turns out that they really have very different messages that are coming from it. With Hayek, it's a kind of an institutional defeatism, and whenever he does describe the American Constitution with its self-conscious design orientation, he's kind of a little bit amazed that it's worked as well as it did for as long as it's done, but he has to acknowledge the fact that this is indeed the truth. If you look at the Rawlsian conception of a veil of ignorance, what he's trying to do is to essentially create a decision theory in which when you do not know your own particular virtues, positions, and places and attitudes in the world, and you have to put together various kinds of design types of features, what you're going to have to do is to find yourself in the following situation. Is that the only way that you can maximize the value of yourself is to maximize the value of the whole. And what that means, in effect, is if you have no idea whether you're the winner or loser in any particular transaction, maximizing its expected value will maximize your position given the uncertainty. And the same thing with more complicated social rules. Now, this is, in fact, a fairly precise mathematical metric. It says, in effect, if you like the calculus, we have a function for individual objectivity, or a maximization of wealth. And if, in fact, we multiply it by n, we get ourselves the social system, precisely because everybody is behind this particular veil. And it turns out when you take the maximum and you just multiply something by a constant, it doesn't change at all in terms of its location. So he's got himself a methodology there, and in fact it's a methodology which is something that our good friend Hayek might well have used. To do this, however, Hayek would have had to abandon, I think, one of his other kinds of presuppositions, which in the end I think was wrong. Hayek was basically of the view that utilitarianism was a snare and a delusion. In that, he kind of shared the same sort of attitudes that Immanuel Kant did towards the same thing. He says there are too many slippery slopes and unexamined crevices into which you can fall, so you don't want to be attracted to that particular side. And I have to say, at one time I tended to agree with that, but as I've gotten older, I've tended to strongly disagree with it and think that it's only if you try to figure out how you do the, quote, utilitarian calculus correctly that you're going to have any substantial chance of getting a good sort of social institutions and arrangement. Now, what do I mean by that as to how you do it? Well, you go back and you try to figure out the following question. When you're looking at all of these individuals, on what issues do you think that their preference structures are likely to be similar, and what issues do you think that their preference structures are likely to be different? And it turns out, I think, that whether you go back to Cicero or to Hobbes or anybody else, what they talked about early on was not the maximization of social welfare. That's a decidedly 20th and 21st century conception. But what they always talked about was self-preservation. And essentially what happens is if you get wiped off the face of the earth, your future is going to be grim no matter what happens after you're gone. How do you like that for a profound social and psychological analysis? And so what you do is you assume that basically everybody, in a sense, has the same common views with respect to the fear of death and of serious physical injury. And so when you try to put together your social organization, and you have to make goods or judgments that are basically going to bind anybody, on everybody if they're going to bind anybody, what you do is you start with the very naive proposition that the first business of any particular state is in fact to constrain the use of force in the way in which it takes place in various elements. And that, of course, gets you very close to the coercion definition that's associated with Hayek. And at least as a first approximation, one of the things that we can start to say about coercion and its relationship to force is as follows. Force is the application of force by one person to another, shooting, kicking, and so forth. Coercion is more complicated because it not only involves the use of force, but it involves the threat of force, and that immediately gets you into the game theoretical issues as to what kinds of threats are going to be credible and which ones are not. And if you take the Hobbesian analysis seriously, as I think you do, you realize that without any form of centralized authority, any equilibrium that you're going to come up with is going to be degenerative, and a lot of people will die very quickly, so that you cannot use that as a model. And you have to figure out how it is you create a monopoly of force, limit its application, so that it essentially, when it applies itself uniformly to all individuals, that each of them will be the gainer relative to what they are in a state of nature. And if you do it in that particular way, it's actually a welfare measure, a Paretian measure to be exact. And what that says is we prefer the state of world in which we have all of these institutions, rights, and so forth, to one in which none of these things exist, because you can't find anybody who's going to be worse off under a stable environment, and you can find a lot of people who can be better off. And indeed, in many of these cases, you can be pretty confident that if the rule is of general application, the level of gains will be relatively constant across individuals, even if you can't measure. So what you do now, in effect, is you now have an area as to why it is that you need some degree of collectivity. But then you look around at these same people, all of whom have abject fear of death, and you ask whether or not they have the same attitude towards good French wines and Italian pizza. And basically the answer is no. People, when it comes to the way in which they wish to lead their lives and to buy the particular goods and services they have, their preference sets are really going to be highly distinctive and unique. There are some people who love the grand life, and there are other people who love to save. There are some people who like to eat garlicky food, other people who do not. And so then the question you have to ask yourself within this model, is there any gains that you can get from the operation of the system in which you force everybody into a unanimous decision, yes or no? We all have garlic, or none of us have garlic in our food. And what you quickly decide is that these preferences are surely separable. I can figure out how to go to a French restaurant, you could go to a Chinese restaurant, somebody could stay at home, somebody could eat carbolic acid for dinner for all I care. And so what happens now is, given this general knowledge, this is what you say. We know enough about the preference sets of other individuals to realize that they know more about those things than we know about those things, so that if in fact you're working in a general regime, a system of freedom of contract that allows people in pairwise comparisons to exchange goods and services with each other will outperform any other kind of system that doesn't give that kind of benefit. So if you now start to put this back against the Hayekian framework, it turns out that this particular model generates both his concern with force and violence on the one hand, and the very strong general preference that he has for freedom of contract on the other. And it does so in a way which seems to be more theoretically rigorous than Hayek's own intuition, because you can now ask somebody to figure out where the system breaks down, how they would put the functions of various kinds of utilities together, and so on. So Hayek essentially says all this, and then what does he do? Later on in the book, he starts to develop a rather coherent and more exhaustive discussion of what it is that he means by coercion. And he essentially gets part of it right, but misses the middle case. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are two extremes, he says, and one of them is the pure competitive market, where people have lots of choices to go to lots of other individuals. And under those circumstances, the question that he has to ask is whether or not a refusal of any individual to do business with any other individual under these particular circumstances mounts as an act of coercion that requires state rectification. It turns out that prior to Hayek, there were a number of people who actually took just that position. The most prominent of them in the American Legal Academy is a man named Robert Lee Hale, writing about the coercion in the supposedly non-coercive state. Hayek actually cites him in a footnote, but does not discuss his position. But his view essentially was that you're every bit as worse off if you don't get what you want from somebody else as if they use force against you, so that the state always has to decide when there are refusals to deal which of them is legitimate and which of them is not. And that means, in effect, that government regulation of any and all contracts in a competitive market is perfectly appropriate. This is not an accident, because Hale was somebody who was strongly in support of what became eventually the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, with collective bargaining, in which refusals to deal with an employer with a union designated and organized by the state, in fact, became an unfair labor practice. And Hayek, in his chapter on labor, is really quite anti-union, to put it mildly. I was surprised when I reread it coming down on the plane this morning, just how explicitly worrisome he was about labor organizations and so forth. And he cites the two great authors of that, Simon in the United States, and a man named Hutt, a great but neglected thinker, who wrote in England and in South Africa, talking about the genuine dangers associated with monopoly unionization, a position which is, if anything, more true today than it was in 1935, at the time that the National Labor Relations Act started to take off. So then what do you have to do? You have to figure out how you get rid of the particular point on the refusal, and the best way in which to do that is to go back to exactly what I said. You're looking at an individual transaction between two parties, and you're trying to figure out what the social welfare function looks if you either allow or deny them freedom of contract in a particular case. And if, in fact, you're in a competitive market, either you have a right to refuse or the market will completely shut down. And when you do give the right to refuse, of course, you do give the right to bargain. And essentially, you could come up with the following very simple proposition. All gains from trade will be exhausted to the extent that you could keep transactions cost low. And sure enough, if you look at another portion of the constitutional liberty, and indeed the general history of contract law, what you discover from Roman times going forward is that the central device of contract law was to develop a set of forms which would allow you in advance to resolve a number of disputes that would likely occur later on. And so the Roman law has the contract of stipulatio. John Locke was clearly referring to the statute of frauds when he talked about rules that would regularize various kinds of exchanges of contract and property. Recordation systems have exactly that kind of role. What you do, in effect, is you give people complete freedom to choose what kind of an arrangement they want, and then if a dispute should arise, you basically have documented two positions on both sides, so it's easier to resolve them after their occurrence. And since it's easier to resolve them when they occur, the probability of their occurrence is going to be much lower. And formality turns out to be one of the great triumphs of the law, one of the more intelligent forms of regulation. Why do we say this? Because if in fact you impose those kinds of limitations on freedom of contract, you increase the velocity of exchange. The greater wealth to both parties gives positive externalities, which allow other individuals to engage in further transactions of their own. So the reason why you allow the refusal to deal to take place is that it's the only thing that you can do to make sure that a competitive market is going to work. You're much more powerful in defending the standard common law position if you can make the positive point that the enforcement of ordinary contracts for sale and hire, or the refusal of people to enter into them, create not only gains for the parties when the transactions take place, are not only unwise if in fact the two parties do not agree, but in fact generate all sorts of benefits to third persons in terms of the opportunities that are going to be created. And if you start to look at the other side and you start to look at force and the threat of force and so forth, you come up with exactly the opposite conclusion. If I am going to make a particular threat to you, I may leave you a choice. It's the choice between your money and your life. You will surely decide under these circumstances to keep your life and to part with your money. But if I can do this all the time, you can then do it all the time. And so instead of saying to people that you have the choice to either accept or refuse a deal, what happens is the other fellow can put two things on the table, both of which you are own, and give you the choice to say which of them you want. So the notion that you are free to choose, a Milton Friedman phrase, Rose Friedman phrase, which is somewhat inexact, doesn't quite get what a market is like unless you understand what the scope of those things are for which choice is going to be protected. And in these particular circumstances, it's abundantly clear that the ability to walk away, the sort of the private exit right, is what essentially drives every one of these transactions. And if you don't have that, then the use of force will necessarily lead to two people creating transactions in which one of them loses more than the other gains. And then if you try to figure out how that's going to work socially, you can see that all of the generalizations are negative. If everybody else can do this, you'll get a repetition of these kinds of transactions. And in addition, it turns out that as the pie shrinks as between two persons, the opportunities to third persons, even if you're in a normal contractual world, will shrink as well. And so the Hobbesian instinct that the threat and use of force is in fact always a negative-sum game and therefore ought to be discouraged, becomes something, I think, of a basic proposition that you do not want to dispute. Now, the thing that I mentioned is the tertium quid, in which everything kind of gets flipped around, and it's one of the great issues of modern time. And Hayek is aware of what the issue is, but he doesn't sufficiently develop the program that is needed to explicate it. Going back to sort of early 20th century thinking, lots of people were worried about the limits on freedom of contract, and they all come up with the same example. It turns out there's somebody wandering around the desert, and somebody else owns the only oasis in town. And it turns out that either you can get water from that oasis and you can surely die, or you will surely die. And the question is whether or not that fellow has some duty to give you access to his particular water, to which the solemn Solons of the world all come up with the answer yes. And the way in which this was put in classical legal theory is it was that necessity suspends all forms of property rights. The question, however, is what does it mean to suspend them? And there are two different variations that you have to worry about. One of them is it means that you can suspend them so the guy can just come in and drink the water, at which point you run a serious problem of sustainability, because if the man gets no revenues from everybody and all these passerbys can take something, it may well be that the oasis will basically silt over and everybody will be the worse off. And so essentially within the classical theory, the necessity was always accompanied by a duty to pay compensation to the other fellow for the fair market value of the product in question. Hayek does not talk about the compensation side in connection with the oasis case. It may seem like a small omission, but it turns out it's a huge admission when you set it against the context of where forced exchanges without a refusal to deal really matter. There is little doubt, I think, in the eyes of any legal historian, that if you're trying to figure out what was distinctive about the constitutional and private law framework in the period immediately after the Civil War, that you would say that the topics of rate regulations, chiefly associated in the beginning with railroads, but extending to other kinds of utilities and common carriers, were the distinctive feature. And essentially, these cases dominated everything that started to take place between the period of, say, 1880, working itself through to the beginning of the Second World War. Now, why is this? Well, to get the historical origin, the place that you begin is with a widely neglected case in the Anglo-American tradition, a case called Allnut in Inglis, which was decided in England in 1810, which brought the phrase affected with the public interest into the legal vocabulary, a phrase which had been adopted in a treatise by Sir Matthew Hale about 140 years before, in the late 17th century. And at issue in that particular case was the very simple situation in which it turned out there was only one harbor in which boats could come. And when they came there, the question is what's to be done with the goods when they were left off. And some of them were to be sent into the inland, and others of them were to be repackaged and to send overseas. And so what the Crown decided to do, in order to attract not only the in trade, but the through trade, was to designate certain custom houses. And if you put your stuff into a custom house, the traditional taxes on entry would be suspended because you would be shipping the things across. This is used today virtually everywhere in the world. If it turns out there's competition in a hub and spoke economy, you want people to come to you, you can't impose upon them the local tax that you can impose upon your own citizens because their elasticity is far greater and everybody else will run. And so what happened is this guy gets the custom house and he promptly raises the fees above and beyond those which are charged in all sorts of other warehouses to which the tax is opposed. And the Crown comes along and it looks at this sort of thing and it says, you know, this is not really very good. We meant to give these guys a tax break, and if half the break we give them is going to be taken by a super competitive price, we're going to lose. When the matter comes to court, it's not the Crown that raises the issue, although clearly it's a public concern. The issue is instead raised by the fellow who had to pay the excessive rates. And what Lord Ellenborough said is that normally if you're dealing in a competitive market, people buy and sell at whatever terms and conditions they see fit. But when you're dealing with this, then in effect with goods affected by the public interest, you have to have reasonable and fair rates. This phrase does not stop in this very simple case, where in fact the appropriate remedy was to cut down the amount of the fees so they equal those which the same goods would have when stored somewhere else. Instead, what happens is, it turns out 65 years later, this phrase is carried over quite literally into the first of the great rate cases in the United States, a case called Munn v. Illinois, a very complicated set of transactions. So what we do is develop in American jurisprudence a class of goods known as those goods which are affected with the public interest, by which we mean that there is now a monopoly supplier. And these goods, like the oasis, are a tertium quid between the two extremes, and Hayek does not systematically develop how it's treated. And the first point to understand about these is that the refusal to deal in the face of a monopoly is not something that can be tolerated. The alternatives are simply too grim for everybody else who's on the other side of the transaction. And if you go back to Allnut in Inglis, that applies whether the monopoly is created by law or whether it's a natural monopoly. So now, in effect, you're required to take people in to some extent, just as the innkeepers had to do on the roads in England in the 13th century. But the key point at this particular issue is that the compensation question, which was neglected, now becomes key to the central analysis. We can't go through all of the complications associated with rate regulation, but you can say a couple of basic points about it. This is strictly a Scylla and Charybdis kind of operation. If you leave the rates to be chosen by the fellow who owns the monopoly of whatever he wants, he's going to extract the monopoly profit. And we're pretty confident, given neoclassical economics, that this is going to result in an inferior output relative to that which you get under competitive conditions. That's why sort of knowing the standard economics, about which Hayek was somewhat skeptical, is really important here, because it gives you the explanation as to why, as a social matter, you want to take away the refusal to deal, which is the fundamental feature of the standard, well-functioning, competitive economy. Well, then once you do that and they have to deal, then the question is, what are the terms in which you do this? If you look at public utilities, what you quickly discover is that the sequence of performance is absolutely vital in the way in which these things are organized. So it turns out, in order to run a railroad and get customers, you have to build the darn thing before you can start allowing people to come out. If, in fact, you want to run a public utility to supply gas or electricity or telephone service, exactly the same sequence of performance issue will start to arise. It follows, therefore, that if you only allow people to recover their marginal cost of service to the customers after the thing is up and running, they will stay in business because they're going to win a little bit more than just by losing everything, but nobody will ever build another public utility because they know that their front-end fixed costs will be essentially evaporated because of the rate rule. So on the other side, you develop, doctrinally, it's a bit of a mess, but intellectually it's absolutely necessary, this whole elaborate body of rate of return regulation in which you say that the quid pro quo for the power to regulate the monopoly is in fact the duty of the state to give you a risk-adjusted competitive return on the assets that are committed to the particular business in question. There is, in this particular period, an enormous debate as to how you calculate those rates, how you calculate that particular rate base, and all the rest of the sort. What I can say, though I can't go into detail now, is that if you actually look at the rules that were put into place by these 19th century and early 20th century judges in the pre-progressive eras, they seem to have an unerring instinct of how things should be done. They were extremely careful to make sure that rate regulation did not become an excuse for cross-subsidies, because cross-subsidies are never allowed under systems of competition. They were also extremely astute to make sure that you had to balance the books in every given period, because if you tell somebody we're taking from you today and we'll let you recover the rates tomorrow, chances are the market may not be there, and this is a device for strategic behavior that cannot be played. So you have a perfectly coherent theory. And the difficulty that you have with the Hayekian conception is, since he doesn't quite figure out the relationship of the oasis example to the general theory, huge areas of law in which it turns out you need something more than a minimum estate can in fact fit within the kind of framework on which it turns out that he's generally in favor of. So thinking about the sort of coercion issues, what you have to do is to learn how to generalize from the Hayekian experience. And I want to hesitate, to stress again, this is a case in which Hayek's sort of general theoretical skepticism hurt him. It was not a case in which he looked at these particular issues and just came out with infuriatingly stupid kinds of conclusions. It was the fact that he just missed what's going on. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things that's so troublesome about the Constitution of Liberty is perhaps the greatest source of its appeal. It's written at an extremely broad level. And when he starts talking about a Constitution of Liberty, he means, well, here's this notion of liberty. How do we develop some kind of constitution that we can start to put around it? What he does not do is actually look at any particular constitution and figure out the way in which its various provisions are to be interpreted and to be worked. Hayek is very much the synoptic thesis. So one time he's talking about the German Reichstag, another time he's talking about the English Constitution, then he will switch off to the American type situation. Almost everything he says has a certain degree of sense, but none of it has what I would call the requisite particularity associated with the way in which these various systems have to operate. And this, in fact, means that many of the kinds of issues that somebody like myself would think to be extremely important tend to get left on the cutting room floor. And by virtue of the fact that Hayek is not really quite emphatic as to how far the principles go, what you see is start to see things slide. When I wrote my book, The Classical Liberal Constitution, the basic conceit of the book is that there were two visions of the world that have been out there for a long time, both of which are wrong, and so we need to have the third. And the two dominant and regnant views that we have today are the sort of Scalia-like view, maybe I think less accurate today, perhaps at the beginning, in which the key judicial virtue on the Supreme Court was one of restraint. And so what you did is you read all constitutional provisions in a way which protect individual rights, but did not upset the fundamental structural choices that were made by Congress and the legislature and by the states on the way in which they organized their inquiry. It turns out that Hayek was actually somewhat sympathetic with this particular point of view. In the Constitution of Liberty, he actually spends a little bit of time talking about the Revolution of 1937, and he does not regard this as a descent into hell. Quite the opposite. He said, this is a case in which we generally want to have a degree of legislative discretion, and probably the courts overstepped their lines, and the correction that we see may have gone a little bit too far, but it was certainly understandable. It was not a full-throated defense of the proposition that unless you preserve individual liberties against government regulation, the entire system can result in massive wealth transfers through various forms of regulation. Now, why is it that Hayek is relatively benevolent? If you read the Constitution of Liberty, and if you read, indeed, even law, liberty, and legislation, or you go back and you look at the situation in the Road to Serfdom, Hayek is surprisingly sympathetic to positive rights with respect to health care, employment benefits, uninsurance, old age protection, and so forth. And generally speaking, if you want to have a regime of positive rights, you're necessarily going to be committed to have a regime in which there's fairly broad degrees of government discretion. A system of negative rights does not depend upon the level of resource wealth in any particular society. A general rule which says that everybody cannot trespass against their neighbor, nobody's allowed to commit fraud, voluntary contracts of exchange in competitive markets are protected. The great virtue of that particular system is that its enforcement is invariant to a large number of things. You can use it in large societies. You can use it in small societies. You could use it in societies with relatively low levels of technological innovation. You could also apply it with levels of high degrees of specialization. You don't have to worry about the notice function because these rules are sufficiently clear. Keep your hands to yourself that everybody more or less understands them. The moment you start moving into the realm of positive rights, everything is going to be contingent. Who's going to pay? How much are they going to pay? What's going to happen if it reduces the level of output in a society? What are the trade-offs between efficiency on the one hand and equity on the other? And you can't do that stuff unless you have a rather large government. And indeed, on this point, Hayek, when you weren't involved with these various trade-offs, was much smarter than the Americans. My favorite illustration of Hayek one, Felix Frankfurter none, has to do with the following passages from first the Road to Serfdom and then from a famous decision called NBC against the United States. And on the Road to Serfdom, Hayek has this wonderful and very accurate description of how it is that a highway system starts to work. He says what we do is we open up this as a road to which everybody can work, and we take no effort whatsoever to determine the composition of the traffic. Hayek was a little bit weak on trying to figure out how it is that a planner figures out where you put the road, how you finance it, and stuff like that. But the open access regime that he saw is a straight takeover from the Roman position on exactly this topic, and it served Hayek as well as it did the Romans. When you get to Felix Frankfurter, what you discover is somebody with a very high IQ and a very high opinion of himself, always believes that he can outsmart the smartest. And so the question then comes up as to how it is that we allocate use on the spectrum. And it turns out Herbert Hoover, who was in fact a progressive, back in 1926 engineered a clear deal in which the following happened. The first thing what he did is he said, look, there is chaos on the airwaves because earlier decisions of the district courts had made it impossible for him as Secretary of Commerce to refuse licenses to anybody who wanted to broadcast. And then even worse, once they were there, he couldn't limit the frequencies that they could use and the strength of the signal that they sent out. So essentially, nobody could understand everybody. To somebody like Hayek, this is a property rights issue. And what you ought to do is to establish clear boundaries. You can broadcast on this frequency with this level of interference at the edge. Somebody else can go there. And then we use a system of private actions for trespass in order to make sure that nobody broadcasts on anybody else's signal. And we let everybody in his own frequency determine the composition of his traffic. When Felix Frankfurter got this, the statute that had been passed by the Federal Radio Commission, later incorporated into the Federal Communications Commission, the first in 1927, the second in 1934, it said in effect that the frequencies were to be allocated in accordance with the public interest, convenience, and necessity. This is anticipating your lecture next week to some extent, right? Yeah, it is. We had to give it back. So anyhow, what's going on in this particular case is Frankfurter thinks that since there's scarcity, you have to have a government administrator decide who gets to broadcast. And he proudly proclaims a year before Hayek wrote that the function of the government in the administrative state is not only to set the rules of the road, but to determine the composition of the traffic. And he says, I can't do that, but I know that the FCC can do that. So we're now going to have all sorts of hearings to decide who gets what frequency and why. To cut the story short, in the broadcast industry, we now have 70-odd years of this experience, and to this particular day, nobody knows what the criteria are that allow you to prefer one applicant to another. And indeed, the way the system works is the government makes some silly decision. It's almost always wrong. And then the guy who gets the frequency sells it off to somebody else in a transaction that's not challenged. So all the rents associated with the frequencies, in fact, go to the private winner of the auction rather than to the government who originally owned the spectrum. And so what you can start to see when you start to look at this stuff is you want to kind of create this very strong system of positive rights. As Hayek was prepared to do, you start to create a very big state, which means in effect that you cannot take the rather thin view of government that is existent in the United States Constitution. Now, how else does this manifest itself? Let me just talk, since I have a grand total of 10 minutes left, about two kinds of issues, one having to do with individual rights and the other having to do with structures, which essentially mark the change between the classical liberal era prior to 1937 and the modern era. The first of these is, in fact, the federalism question. Hayek basically has the intuition that federalism is a nice way in which you can diffuse power. But he does not spend any time trying to explain, when you're dealing with federalism, what kind of issues belong at what level and why. It turns out, if you take the pre-1937 cases, these guys were unerringly good at trying to figure out what went on. The first of the cases that sort of set the basic framework was a case called Gibbons against Ogden, decided in 1824. And what Justice Marshall said was that if you run a steamship powered by steam power from Elizabethtown, New Jersey into New York Harbor, you are engaged in interstate commerce for the entire length of the journey. This may sound to you to be perfectly trivial, but in fact, in a case called Manningen, decided some 8 years before, Chancellor James Kent of New York, one of the 10 greatest jurists in the history, I think, of America, had decided this question in exactly the opposite direction. Interior traffic is, in fact, the exclusive jurisdiction of the states. The federal government could simply piece the barriers as you move from one state to another. Now, it seems, therefore, that our friend Marshall is extremely broad, but compared to what happened afterwards, he was exceptionally narrow. And this is reflected in two notions. One is, he said quite clearly, that the entire internal commerce of any particular state is beyond the scope of the federal power. And what he meant by that, roughly speaking in modern terms, once you get off the airplane and you get into a cab and go from Reagan down to here, you're in local commerce, you're not in interstate commerce. So essentially every journey has three legs, or can. One is the local leg that gets you to the airport, then the interstate airport, and then local on the other side. And oh, by the way, if it turns out that the airline that you travel starts in Los Angeles and ends in San Francisco, you're still in interstate commerce. In addition to this, it turns out that if you start to look at local manufacture, agriculture, and mining, these things all take place prior to interstate commerce, and they too are not subject to federal regulation. And so what he did, in effect, was to create a system which had two very desirable features. One of the features is that what you do is you now have only one particular government that is capable of regulating the vast amount of activities that take place. This means that you don't have to figure out whether you have to yield to federal commands or state commands, or worse, that the two of them try to coordinate themselves so as to make your life absolutely miserable. Having a single sovereign instead of dual sovereigns that could combine in war with one another is, in fact, an enormous protection for individual liberty. It also means that with respect to competitive industries, there is now a natural break on what any given state can do, because the exit right you tax me very heavily in our particular state, I'm going to take my business somewhere else, is in fact a form of competitive federalism which puts some limit on what can be done. It would be a mistake to assume that this is an absolutely fail-safe operation, because one of the things that you cannot move across jurisdictional lines is, of course, land itself. And so what happens is, after the 1868 amendment, we have even a cleverer form of federalism. We have something known as the Privileges or Immunities Clause that says that no state shall make or enforce any law that abridges the privileges and immunities of the citizens of the United States or the several states. One breath, right? And what that meant, in effect, is that the federal government would intervene in the state level in order to preserve competitive institutions which local politics might otherwise disturb. So there was, at least under this model, a federal veto over state mischief, but there was not dual federal jurisdiction, which is in fact exactly the right distribution of powers that you want. On the other hand, when you're dealing with interstate commerce, the great danger that you have there is balkanization. So if you're running a railroad across the country, and at any particular level a state can impose a special tax or a barrier upon you, you can never complete the journey. This is basically the modern version of the Rhine River problem solved by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, where they got rid of all the bridges that were essentially, or toll booths that were put there so that you have free movement up and down the river. And in fact, in modern economics, what this is called is the double marginalization problem, meaning in effect, when you have successive inputs, each subject to monopoly exaction, the total level of the consumer surplus absolutely is shattered. Most economic effects that you see tend to be small. This one, no matter what your assumptions about linearity and nonlinearity on these various curves, it's just huge. 90% of this stuff or more can be dissipated by 3 or 4 people. And essentially what the Dormant Commerce Clause did, or the Commerce Clause did, was to allow Congress to make sure that it could facilitate these transactions. Congress, unfortunately, did not always do this, and so one of the great sort of judicial inventions was the Dormant Commerce Clause, where the court said essentially you can't mess up with these competitive movements back and forth state lines unless you have some very good reasons, and all the reasons that they came up with were quite consistent with classical liberal theory. You can't ship into some state toxic and poisonous substances that will destroy local flora and fauna, for example. Now, when the New Deal comes along, it's a completely different assumption. It's Felix Frankfurter writ large. And now the argument is, oh my God, you've got all these competitive states. This is just absolutely horrible. We need to have uniformity, and we're going to do it from the top. And so these artificial, they are now called, distinctions between agriculture, mining, and manufacture on the one hand, and interstate commerce on the other, are a thing of the past, and the federal government can do anything. This now gives you dual sovereigns. It gives you an enormous question of when the federal law displaces the state law. It subjects you to double regulations that are inconsistent. It is, in general, a great intellectual disaster. And Hayek, simply by being in favor of federalism, was not aware of the huge difference between federalism circa 1900 and settleism circa 1950. The same thing could be said when you start to look at this in connection with the various issues associating with taking. Hayek has a passage in his book which is essentially strongly against expropriation, and for the most part he seems to understand what's about. If you, in fact, you allow somebody to take from a given individual something for nothing, it turns out that your willingness to produce and to preserve and to maintain various kinds of assets is going to be limited, because in financial terms there's somebody sitting out there who has a call option that can be exercised at any time for any reason at zero price. And we would never give that kind of power to any private individual over another person's land. And indeed, if you start looking about the way in which markets work, you could probably find 1 million plots of land in the United States, and nobody gratuitously gives that kind of option to somebody else. Indeed, all the call options that you see tend to require that it be exercised at either a fixed or a market price in order to get rid of the expropriation that takes place. But the takings clause was examined and understood in these particular days without any regard to the complexities associated with this system. And so what they did is they essentially got rid of the price mechanism. And the issue then gets organized in the following way. I'll take 3 minutes maybe. And this is what it is. On the one hand, what we do is we say that if you have physical takings, occupy the land, you have to pay market value. And even that turns out to be essentially insufficient. It ignores, for example, subjective value over market value. It ignores the cost of relocation. It ignores the cost of appraisal. So essentially, you don't compensate for full losses, and you get too much confiscation taking place by the government. But the greater loss turns out to be in the area of regulation, and this was accomplished by two important cases. One before Hayek wrote, a case called the Willow River. What Justice Jackson said is, we don't have to follow private law conceptions of property rights when the government comes in. And he gave the government a trump, so-called navigation easement, which meant that you could wreck anybody's private mill in ways that could be enjoined if done by a private party, for which you could get compensation. Now there's no injunction and there's no compensation. And that decision then gets taken over into the worst of the modern decisions, a case called Penn Central, in which what we do is we say if we're dealing with regulation, the government can do pretty much what it wants, notwithstanding the adverse consequences to the individuals, whereas if you take the land, you pay. And then you have to figure out what's a regulation on the one hand and what's the taking on the other. And of course, that's extremely difficult, because if you look again to state law, air rights in New York are fully protected property rights. By the time Justice Brennan gets through with them, it turns out that they don't matter at all. Why is that? Well, Hayek was a very good financial economist. Justice Brennan was not. And he said, when I value the land, it's quite clear that when you really care about the land and not about the option for the development rights, you therefore have no reasonable expectation that you can develop your rights for the building on top of the terminal, and so we can take them for zero. Any financial analysis would start to tell you that options to build have positive value, they are property rights that can be traded, and old friend Justice Brennan doesn't do it. So what's happened in the modern law? The Hayekian vision implicitly has the following basic assumption. It assumes that if we establish a stable set of relationships amongst private parties, we require the state, when it exercises its power of confiscation or regulation, to respect them to the point where it can stop people when private individuals can stop them. But if in fact it wants to take something, it has to pay for it. When Justice Brennan comes along, he breaks that particular connection. You can now regulate without compensation, pretend there's an artificial distinction between taking partial interest in land and total interest in land, and get yourself to a very much broader state. The great tragedy, in some sense, of the Constitution for Liberty is it sets out all of the basic propositions, all of the tools that you need to get the analysis right, but it does not, in effect, close. And when I wrote the classical liberal Constitution, essentially I'm using a Hayekian-like framework, trying to see, when you look at the particular clauses of the original Constitution, how they're put together. And the great sadness that we had is a great constitutional legacy, which was lost to politics and intellectual confusion. Thank you. May I take a drink? I can't see any of you. One of the reasons I never use notes is you can't read them. Another is I can't change my mind in the middle of a speech. So if there's somebody who would like to ask a question, I will attempt to answer it with as little evasion and obnoxious behavior as is possible. Sir? Is there a microphone here? Come to the microphones, or let the microphones come to you. Maybe it's easier to bring the mics to them. That way what happens is we don't avoid the dead time. Now, as I was saying, I'm going to give another lecture. Okay, sir?
The issue may be, because it's more political than economic, Hayek may not have addressed it, but to your knowledge, did he express any opinions or thoughts, and be particularly relevant since he was not an American or not a Native American, about the Supreme Court and the seemingly infinite powers that it has, particularly vis-a-vis other countries?
Well, as I mentioned in the talk, he did talk briefly about the 1937 constitutional revolution and systematically underestimated its importance on both issues of individual rights and upon structures. And I think the reason he did this is because, like many political philosophers, he did not pay sufficient attention to details, and these are details that really matter. One of the things that you always try to teach your students and always try to remind yourself is that it's not just the preamble and the first position or proposition of any statute that matters. You have to worry about all the exceptions. You have to worry about all the procedural limitations. You have to worry about all the technical stuff. Because if it turns out there's a special interest group that's coming along that can tailor the exception, they're quite happy to give up on the general rule. And I think that Hayek, by and large, did not see that. I think somebody like Frankfurter, he may have been wrong on everything, and in fact, I think pretty clearly was. But at least he understood that he was playing a high-stakes game. And when he played the game, therefore, he tried to write it in a way that would switch as much of the territory from private action into public control. The decision that I gave you, for example, on the spectrum is only one. Frankfurter, for example, was deeply hostile to religious liberties. And so there was a famous case called Pierce against Meyer. Pierce and Meyer, there are two cases, Pierce against Oregon, whatever. And these were cases which affirmed the right of individuals to exercise or to raise their children on educational matters as they see fit. One said, you could allow them to speak German, they could go to private schools, were the two decisions that they have. Frankfurter was fiercely opposed to both of them. And one of the reasons was that as a youth, he came over to the United States, didn't speak any English, and his public school teachers drowned it into him. So he thought that authoritarian conversion to the common life of the United States would in fact drive him. This then, after these two cases came out, expressed itself in his academic writing, where he said these are horrible decisions because one of the things that they do is it makes it much more difficult to have collective bargaining and labor relations, which he was strongly in favor. So he was willing to throw religious liberty under the bus in order to make sure that he could throw economic liberties under the bus. This is a rare twosome. This then affects itself. Many of you may remember the flag salute cases, which were some of the leading cases of the early 1940s. There was a case called Gobaitis and one called Barnett. And in the first one, Frankfurter wrote the opinion in which he announced that a required mandatory flag salute was required of all individuals, including Jehovah's Witnesses, who thought that the salute or respect to the flag was a form of idolatry. And he said this is necessary to maintain the communitarian spirit in this country at the barrel of a gun, if need be. 2 years later, 3 years later, this comes up again. Our friend Robert Jackson, who was a collectivist on many issues, said if there's one fixed star in the judicial firmament is that we don't coerce speech out of individuals. And there's a Frankfurter dissent, and it's just like clockwork. He says the problem about this is all these libertarian fantasies that people like Justice Jackson do interfere with understanding about the huge interests of the community. It's not a mistake that the NBC case and the dissent that he wrote in Barnett both come out in 1943. And what's truly tragic about the dissent in Barnett is this is in the middle of World War II when you're trying to fight a Nazi ideology for which forced coercion to a particular form of behavior is in fact a necessary part of the overall system. So the guy essentially did have a very consistent ideology. The problem was it was consistently and disastrously wrong on those issues. Okay? All right, who's next? Is there one on this side? I don't know which side the microphones are on. I can't see anyway. Okay, we just have only people on my right wing. That's all right. Oh, is there a left winger here? Wait, it must be Zawicki.
Of course.
Because he's not in his seat like he should be.
When you said left winger, it had to be me, right?
No, you're just
I'm
last
so well known.
You're just last in the alphabet, guy. Well, it depends on which way you face, right?
So, Richard, I'm thinking about how Hayek might respond, and I'm focusing in particular on your argument that Hayek ignores the middle case, and I take your argument to be the following, which is if we start with Hayek's proposition, he wants to have rules of general applicability, right? That's the basic logic of the Constitution of Liberty. And I understand your critique to essentially be that's not good enough. That there that there are reasonable exceptions that have to be made, and so Hayek's hard line on rules of general applicability won't withstand serious scrutiny. So you have to have the middle case, which is the exception to the general rule, the modification of the general rule. But now, in response to the last question, just said, well, doesn't this raise the specter that as soon as you introduce the exception, that the exception itself gets swallowed, ends up swallowing up the rule. And might Hayek's response be, yeah, you've just defeated your own argument, which is you've come back around to my side, which is recognizing that while the general rule may not be ideal, it's the only stable equilibrium we can get without the exceptions and the ad hocery starting to swallow up the rule and divulging in special interest politics.
I don't think that's true. One of the striking things about the pre-Frankfurtian justice, that is those guys who were not in the progressive, is they managed to keep the line perfectly clear for a very long period of time. So when they said that something was affected with the public interest, what they really meant was that it was a monopoly industry which was subject to regulation. And the regulation in many cases would be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. And the reason you're doing this is there's a monopoly rent that's a distortion and you're trying to get rid of it. The key opposition to this would be, what do you think about a case like Lochner against New York, right? And here you're talking about a bunch of bakers in upstate New York, and they work quite happily one to another. The way the system works, and David Bernstein, I think, has basically illustrated this extremely well, but you don't even have to read everything David writes. You just have to read the statute. And what the statute, in effect, has is two provisions next to one another. One of these provisions says in Section 9 that anybody who sleeps on the job must have adequate ventilation. And then the other provision says that nobody's allowed to work more than 60 hours a week or 10 hours in a particular day. And the question is whether or not this is neutral laws of general applicability of the sort that Hayek would like, right? And this is what essentially Peckham knew, not quite what he said. You see this ventilation stuff there. And now all of a sudden you know that these guys are actually sleeping on the job. Well, why on earth would anybody be sleeping on a job? And what happened was you had a single set of bakers in non-union shops, and they would bake the bread at, say, 5, 6, or 7 o'clock at night. They go to bed for 7 or 8 hours, and then they would get up at 4, 5, or 6 in the morning, and they would then take the loaves and package them and ship them off to market, and they will work in 12, 13-hour, 14-hour days, sleeping in the middle. And the rule on the ventilation was essentially trying to raise the cost of a rival business above and that what market would do. Our friend Peckham was not a consistent libertarian. He actually was a little bit muddy, everybody was. He said that this was okay as a health regulation, and Zawicki will come back and said he missed the point that this is a selective invocation for anti-competitive purposes. If you look at any international trade agreements, they always have caveats about health and safety regulation as being disguised as for keeping out competitive goods. You know, the scares with respect to the Chilean grapes is a perfect illustration of that. But the other provision, which was straight on the hours, doesn't have any kind of health pretext. It's the clean case. And so he struck that down, and it wasn't quite clear, if you read the decision, whether he was talking about paternalism, which is certainly accurate in this case, or the preservation of competitive power. But what was clear is that labor regulation was not permitted under the earlier versions of the police power, which meant that when in 1908, a couple of years later, the issue was mandatory unionization. First Justice Harlan at the federal court, and then in a much better opinion, Justice Mahlon of Pitney in a case called Coppage in Kansas in 1950, said this is sheer monopolization, that the appropriate way to understand voluntary transaction is they produce mutual gain between the parties, and the necessary correlate of that is you can never be sure of their distributional consequences, but so long as they're positive-sum games, that's my term, but he basically understood it, let them do it as it was. Now, if you understand it, the equilibrium is now stable. So I recently went off to Stanford in an act of, shall we say, high-risk opportunity, and I basically defended the repeal of the Civil Rights Act and competitive labor organizations on a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You have to understand, tact is no part of my nature. And the argument that I made was essentially this. You start talking to me about monopoly structures, and I'm going to understand exactly why it is you want non-discrimination rules. And for passengers on certain kinds of railroads, that's clearly the case. But if you're talking about competitive labor markets, it's never the case unless there's so much violence and corruption in the society that essentially free entry is frustrated by political force, a fairly accurate description of what happened in the South in 1900 to 1964. So at that point, you don't have competitive circumstances. So if you keep the theory, it's not going to collapse. If you don't understand the theory, then you're going to be in a terrible danger, because people will start coming up with these public utility explanations, and if you treat it as the pure case, they're going to be really upset about arbitrary turnoffs and all the rest of this stuff. If you have an intermediate theory, you can beat that back, and then what you have to be, which I am, you have to be absolutely ferocious to defend the integrity of the theory against all comers. So to give you but another illustration, religious liberty today is in a very bad place, because what we tell people is, if you want to open up a bakery, you have to make wedding cakes for same-sex couples, even if it's against your religious beliefs. And the usual answer that I would give is, if you're in the city of Albuquerque, there are 25 places that you can go, and it's just not appropriate to say to anybody, either you knuckle down on your religious beliefs or you leave the business. We don't give people those choices. The choice that we have is to accept or refuse anybody until you become a common carrier. They say, well, there's huge emotional distress to the people who don't get served. Well, that's a joke to some extent, because they're thrilled about the ability to take people and to push them into corners, and nobody worries about the enormous anxiety, emotional distress, and economic dislocation of the poor individual who is now forced, because of reasons of conscience, to leave the marketplace. And so what the Civil Liberties Union starts to do is that they say, it turns out religious freedom only applies to worship. It doesn't apply to the way in which you live your lives. Every religious person I know understands that free exercise is the way in which you conduct your life one way or another. And you have to be extremely careful. So when the government, in fact, does have a monopoly, you have to be very careful about how it exercises it. So to take the cases, can you require Jewish soldiers or Muslim soldiers to eat pork underneath a general rule? The single worst decision that Justice Scalia ever penned, I'll repeat that, the single worst decision that he ever penned was Smith against the Employment Office in 1990, where he said any general rule, a rule of general applicability, is good against any challenge on religious liberty grounds. The previous tradition had always been one of accommodation, understanding the difficulties. So if you want to join the military and what your particular religious beliefs requires you to do is to stand up and to run naked in front of the enemy lines where you can be shot or killed, we can do something about that. Trade-offs are extremely difficult in these kinds of environments, and accommodations are extremely important. But when you announce that no accommodations are going to be needed, you're on the wrong side of the thing, because now you've forgotten the monopoly power of the state with respect to the way in which it runs its conscription services, and you just can see the decline that starts to take place as you now have more and more aggressive provisions of government services and an Obama administration which is determined to make sure that every religious employer supplies benefits against conscience as part of its general program or face the consequences. So, Todd, I think not only can you maintain this distinction, you just absolutely have to maintain this distinction, because if in effect you say there's always a competitive solution when there isn't, and you give up on the monopoly case, nobody's going to believe you with respect to what competitive solutions are about. So that's my answer to Hayek. Thank you. Question?
All right, thank you. You spoke at a length about utilitarian calculation. To what extent do you believe that things like tradition, custom, and habit influence that utilitarian calculation?
You're absolutely right to ask that particular question. And it's an extremely important one. And I think this is the sort of answer that I would want to give. Let's start with the simplest two-party private contract type arrangement. And it turns out that they're people in an ordinary course of business, and they express some terms, but they leave others that are unspoken. But it is widely understood that there are implied terms as a matter of custom and practice. You'd be absolutely insane under these circumstances to disregard the custom and the practice in dealing with these things. This was extremely clear in the Roman law. It gets carried over in the modern law. If I turn out to say, I'm going to sell you a hamburger, and you say, I'm going to buy it, there are a couple of things that we start to notice. One is if I sell you a hamburger and put it in a piece of plexiglass so you can't get at the food, somehow or other I've not provided to you in a form which is customarily accepted, so it's no longer a merchantable good. If it turns out that it's filled with lice and other kinds of vermin, again, the argument on merchantability is well established. If it turns out I'm selling you a hamburger that I stole from somebody else or a machine, I have essentially violated my warranties on title. This particular dichotomy, you deal with the kinds of goods and you deal with the ownership of the goods, have been implied terms in every contract in every civilization from the beginning of time. And the explanation is as follows. You don't want people to have to state things that they haven't thought about when you know that these conditions almost invariably basically improve the efficiency of the overall transaction. And so a good common lawyer, seeing that these rules are common throughout the realm, when it comes to the question of whether or not you imply these particular terms, will do so. Now, this is extremely important because it tells you something about what's wrong with modern constitutional interpretation, which is we have too much of a discussion today about text and whether or not it's the original public meaning or the private meaning. It's not that these things are unimportant, but the entire Constitution has a huge set of implied terms as well, the most notable of which is the police power. Essentially, you have ordinary liberties to engage in free exercise of religion. If your religion requires you to pick a random child off the street and have a sacrifice in public where you murder him, sorry, you can't do it, because liberty is always subject to a side constraint against the use of force of other individuals. When you're talking about custom, exactly the same thing happens. So one of the particular issues that you always get faced with is, well, you go back and you look from Roman times all the way up to the 19th century, and slavery was a customary way of doing business. And so therefore, in effect, what happens is it's going to be respected. Justinian actually did two things. It wasn't Justinian, it was his lawyers, right, Tribonian and company. They said, one is that slavery is against natural liberty, and they actually meant it. And two, we have it, so here's how it works. And, you know, you spend more time on the second than you do on the first. But when you try to go forward, the one sentence which explains that you're not allowed to infringe upon natural liberties is more powerful. So what's the rule? You never allow a custom between A and B to prejudice the interest of C any more than you allow a contract between A and B to prejudice the interest of C. So if there's a custom that you and I are going to enslave a third person, that's no better than an explicit agreement that the two of us are going to hijack, kidnap, imprison, and torture the particular person. So essentially, the general rule on externalities is the limitation of custom. Now, there are other problems. I'll just mention one of them. How good are these kinds of customs, and when do they break down? Hayek, I think, gets this wrong. He thinks of relatively stable economies in which the customs go by trial and error and small increments. His basic view of this was that the law merchant that existed in Europe, say in the 15th, 16th, 14th century and so forth, was an illustration of that. That's pretty clearly wrong. First of all, there were courts that did it. But the interesting thing about these courts, and the good thing about these courts, is they never heard of Erie Railroad against Tompkins. So what they did is they had private enforcement of general natural law principles, and these were actually much more uniform than happened. The United States Supreme Court used natural law principles all the time before Erie against Tompkins, and just as a brute empirical experience, they were a hell of a lot better deciding cases on concrete grounds when they didn't try to figure out whether it was the godforsaken law of Vermont or that law of New York which governed the case. They just decided the disputes that came to them on the basis of this kind of system. And you have to understand it's fine, but when you have really rapid movements, it turns out custom can't adapt rapidly enough. And so private institutions adapt. They form governance committees of one form or another, best practices committees, to try to essentially handle this. So if there's a confusion, which happened after the great case of Raffles and Wickelshaus involving two ships named Peerless, you didn't get a bunch of grammarians deciding the difference between Sinn and Bedeutung, meaning and reference. What you did is you got a committee together and said, we got 17 ships named Peerless, that's not very good, let's give every boat a number. And that ended that particular problem. And it's just extremely important that you recognize you can't get numbers by custom, right? Hernando de Soto, when he starts talking about one of the things that a society has to do, he says we have to have street addresses, because otherwise the postman doesn't know where to give the letters. We say, okay, we'll have a private postman. He won't know either. Right? So what you do is you want to figure out those kinds of functions that can work that way. And essentially, the 19th century guys got it right. The huge mistake was 1933. It was our friend Learned Hand who said, in connection with ship-to-shore radio, that there was a custom that nobody needed to have one, when in fact, Everybody had them. The only question was whether they were brought on by the captain of the boat or supplied with the equipment. And he says an entire calling can adopt inefficient practices. And this judge, brilliant as he was, seemed to think that nobody believed that radio connection to the shore would help as an aid to navigation in face of the perils of the sea. And of course, if you run a cost-benefit analysis, it's going to instantly be adopted, but historically that's exactly what happened. We just had one guy with a broken radio, and now every time you get a product liability case, people cite learned hand, saying an entire industry is lagged behind what it ought to do, and almost invariably in every case, they don't understand how the industry works. Okay, next.
My question is on the waterways example and its
Yes.
extrapolation. I don't understand how the life and death case used in the example is transferred and applied to other examples of monopolies, which are not cases of life and death. Is there objections that the parallel is not exactly there, or am I missing something?
No, look, the argument is as follows. If you're looking at the Oasis case, it's the first and most obvious case for intervention. And virtually every legal system that we know has said, in effect, that property rights are suspended in the event of storms. The two great American cases on this date from 1908 and 1910. The first one says, in effect, that if you're in the middle of the storm and the only way you can salvage yourself is to go on somebody else's dock, and he tries to resist you, you can use force against him, or in fact, if he throws you off, you can sue him for keeping you off your own dock. And then the second case, called Vincent and Lake Erie, decided 2 years later, somebody is caught on a dock. There's a huge dispute about assumption of risk because there was a dockage contract. But assume that it was a boat coming in from the sea. He ties himself up and he keeps on bashing the dock to save the boat. And what the guy says is, you're allowed to do that, but you have to pay just compensation. Now, these cases are extremely important, but limited so, because you need to have extreme necessities, and you have to assume, as per the last question, that there is no customary situation about maritime rescue. And in fact, there always was and continues to be. I found out just a couple of years ago, that the reason that Proof v. Putnam arose is the people whom they tossed off the dock were pirates, and nobody liked them. It was a completely atypical case, and that's why we haven't seen this thing come up. I mean, I was raised in something of a nautical family many years ago, and what we discovered at that particular time is that the moment somebody comes in, everybody jumps off to give them a hand. That people have very powerful reciprocal customs on this issue. Now, the rate regulation case is a bolt from the blue, because you don't have this obvious physical situation, and you have to essentially think that there's something deeply wrong with monopoly. And in fact, that was the belief. There was a case called Mitchell and Reynolds, decided about 1710, in which the English courts decided that they would not enforce those contracts which were in restraint of trade. And this sort of sounds like the origin of the antitrust law. And in fact, the contract there was kind of unusual. It was a contract in which somebody agreed not to compete with somebody else after the term of employment. And immediately the judges understood that there was a difficult trade-off, and it gets played out in the following way. If in fact you tell this guy he can't work again in your particular industry, what you're doing is you're harming all the customers who might prefer him to the other guy. But if you allow him to work immediately, he will simply take the customer's list from his boss and undermine the proprietary interest. So what they do is they then develop a three-part test, a little bit messy, in which talks about the duration that you can impose the restriction, the geographical area that you can impose the restriction, and the kind of work that you can impose the restriction, in an effort to trade off what the differences are. When you get to rate regulation, it's a very different kind of game. Because now what you do is you have somebody who's running this large business. They may have a state monopoly, or they may in fact be the only person in town. And immediately you realize that if they can jack up the prices and engage in discrimination, you're going to get even more severe economic distortions than you got in the restraint of trade case that I just talked about. And so there was never a question in the United States or in England that you could actually do this. The real question was how you were able to do it. The great difficulty today in modern cases is that the second constraint, that people are allowed to get a competitive return, risk adjusted, on their invested capital tends to be systematically undermined by certain of Ginsburg's colleagues and so forth. And what you have to do is to really sort of fight that. But again, it's the same answer to Todd. If you try to take the position that this is an empty set of cases in which you want to impose these kinds of restrictions, you're going to get beaten to a pulp by people on the other side. The single most important thing to do, and I'm going to end on this because this is my last question, I've been told. Sorry, happy to take them afterwards, is as follows. When you're dealing with government regulation, essentially, this is the ideal and this is the forbidden ground. The ideal is essentially you want to do two things. The first thing is whenever you have coercive government projects, you want to make sure that there's a positive sum project. And the requirement of either express or implied compensation means that if you can give some compensation to everybody and there's some residual that's left over, you satisfied that. So the just compensation requirement replaces the rule that you have to get unanimous consent because it allows you to avoid holdout problems that are very severe and now restricts you into this area of of positive sum game. It turns out that this condition is too weak, not too strong. And the reason it's too weak is suppose you have a positive sum game, and the hard question that you have to ask is how much gain do you have and how is this gain going to be allocated? So if everybody starts with 10 and you manage in a society of 10 people to boost the gain up to 200, right? It's a Pareto improvement if one guy gets 99 and everybody else gets a tiny little fraction. But each person wants to be the 99 guy. And so what happens is the rule which essentially calls for proration of gain is designed to minimize the dissipation of surplus in positive sum transactions. And this maps perfectly into the so-called doctrine of unconstitutional conditions, which limits the kind of conditions that the government can impose on various kinds of permits. So you put these two doctrines together, and what happens is it turns out you kill off the bad projects and you maximize the gains from the good project, but you have to do all the valuation and hard work that it takes to make it to go. You have to trust me since I have 1 minute. I think it can be done. The one thing you do not want to happen is what you do is you create a system of regulation, force everybody to put money into a common pool, and then have transformations which meet neither of these two conditions. They're negative sum. One guy wins big, everybody else loses. There's no surplus to divide, or it's dissipated. And the left essentially thrives on the notion of community by saying so long as there's a need for government regulation, we don't care about the distribution of the gains and losses once that's put into place. And that was exactly the logic of the Penn Central case, which is why it stands as, I think, the single most dangerous expression of government power written in the last half of the 20th century. So you can do the regulation stuff right, but you have to work at it, and you got to go through enough of these variations to see whether or not this is disguised transfer through regulation or whether it's a Pareto improvement, ideally a pro rata Pareto improvement through it. And that's why, just to end on this sentence, when you look at the non-discrimination rules, all of them basically translate into pro rata gains and losses in many consequences, and the great advantage of a pro rata rule is that it automatically allocates the gain roughly equal in proportion to investment, which is why you have pro rata gains and losses in a corporate context, not in connection with the number of shareholders, but with respect to the numbers of shares. These are very simple and very powerful anti-redistributive devices, which then mean that government coercion will increase the rate of return on investment, and you will not have the confiscation issue that we have today. Well, it's 5:30. Thank you all. Okay, I'm going to go sit down.
You can stay right here.
I can stand here.
Yeah, you stand here.
Okay.
I just have a couple announcements, and the first announcement is that the next conversation with Tyler will be with Cliff Asness, and it'll be on November 11th at 3:30 right here.
My friends.
Yeah. Wonderful. It'll be a great conversation.
Oh, yes.
And then on December 10th, which is a Thursday out in Fairfax, we will have a similar event with Roland Fryer, who is this year's John Bates Clark Medal winner, on the topic of education, inequality, and incentives. And so that will be at 4 o'clock on December 10th. I hope many of you will be able to attend that. Just a few acknowledgments. In the back of your brochure, there's acknowledgement of the various donors that helped. We need to make sure that we acknowledge that, especially the Templeton Foundation, whose support was the impetus for us starting our Hayek program. And I also want to thank the Mercatus staff and Claire Morgan and the academic and student programs team for all the work they did do. And then finally, I want to tell a story. I think Takings came out in 1985. Is that correct? Is that right?
Yeah.
So Takings came out in 1985, and Leonard Liggio at the Institute for Humane Studies arranged for Richard to come to George Mason University, and they were going to give, IHS was going to give books of Takings to everyone. Richard came and gave some talks, and then he was going to be able to sign the books. But Leonard knew that I was a very enthusiastic young student and that I would have some difficulties with aspects of Richard's argument because I was a Rothbardian, Lockean type. And so everyone lines up to get their books signed after Richard gives his talk. And we're all lining up there, and everyone's signing. Richard's signing, very nice. And obviously, they were just brand new books, so no one's book had even been cracked. But then he gets to my book, and I had had it for a week because Leonard gave it to me in advance. And I only had read the beginning, but I had, dog-eared pages and things like that. And so Richard stands in front of everyone and says, "Someone who's read my book." He says, "Let's see what he says about my book." And so he opens it up. And I was in the Rothbard school of commenting on books at that time. So he opens it up, and there's in big red letters some very bad words. And he looks at me and he says, "Oh, you don't like the book?" And I said, No, I like the book and everything. I just don't like it. He goes, "What don't you like about the book?" And I said, I don't like all this Hobbes stuff, this Hobbes and Locke. And so I handed him my book, and he signed it. From a successful cross between a Hobbesian and a Lockean, Richard Epstein. And there are for sale copies out there of the classical liberal constitution. If you have dog-eared pages, don't be surprised if he reacts to that. But if not, he's also available to sign that. So please join me in thanking Richard again for a wonderful talk. Thank you.